It was supposed to be a peaceful evening in Montecito. The sky had turned a shade of gold only California could produce. That sleepy hour just before sunset, when the elite tucked themselves into their gated mansions, away from the glaring eyes of paparazzi and public opinion. For most, the day was ending in calm. But at one address, tucked behind perfectly trimmed hedges and security posts, chaos was erupting. Neighbors didn't hear the typical laughter of children playing on the patio. They didn't hear the soft buzz of quiet conversation or the clinking of wine glasses. What they heard instead was something far more chilling. Glass shattering, screaming, something or someone slamming hard against a wall. And then, perhaps most frightening of all, silence. A silence so eerie, so abrupt, it compelled one shaken neighbor to dial 911 without thinking twice. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. 911. What's your emergency? A trembling reply. Something terrible's happening at the Sussex house. I think someone's really hurt. You need to come now. Please. Hurry. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights flooded the quiet road. Sirens wailed through the wealthy enclave. What was unfolding behind those pristine gates would soon become one of the most shocking, private implosions in royal history. Prince Harry, second son of King Charles, once the most beloved royal in the world, and Meghan Markle, the former actress-turned-duchess-turned-global activist, were about to be seen in a light no one could have predicted. The scene that greeted the responding officers was described by one insider as absolute bedlam. The front door was ajar. A vase lay shattered across the marble floor. Meghan was sitting on the stairs, her head in her hands, trembling. Harry was pacing back and forth near the kitchen island, bleeding from a gash on his forearm, muttering angrily. Neither of them noticed the officers at first. It was only when they were ordered to stop and show their hands that they snapped out of their spiraling trance. They were both handcuffed, not because they were fugitives, not because they had harmed anyone else, but because the scene suggested an active domestic dispute that had escalated into physical harm. And in the state of California, that meant both parties had to be restrained for safety and legal clarity. For the world, the unraveling began the moment those handcuff clicks echoed across the front porch. How did it come to this? How did the once radiant couple who captured the imagination of millions with their wedding, their departure from royal duties, and their vision of a better world, find themselves injured, humiliated, and shackled, both emotionally and literally, on their own property? To understand this moment, we must rewind. Back to a marriage under strain, a man caught between two worlds, a woman fighting to keep control of a narrative slipping through her fingers, and a family battle over the future of two innocent children, Archie and Lilibet. For weeks before this explosive evening, something had been building behind the Sussex's walls. Sources close to the couple described the atmosphere in their Montecito mansion as tense, unpredictable, and emotionally charged. Arguments weren't uncommon, but what had changed recently was the tone. Gone were the whispered disputes behind closed doors. In their place came raised voices, slammed doors, and tearful exits. Harry, according to one longtime friend, had been growing increasingly anxious about his decision to stay in California. The documentary deals, the Spotify fallout, the memoir, the late-night interviews, none of it had brought him the peace he once craved. He missed his homeland. He missed his military affiliations, and most of all, he missed feeling like a man with purpose. According to another insider, Harry had recently begun confiding in British lawyers. The reason? Custody arrangements. "I can't do this anymore," he had reportedly said during a phone call. "I need to go back home, and I'm not leaving my children behind." These weren't empty words. Friends allege Harry had initiated discreet inquiries into what it would legally take to file for full custody of Archie and Lilibet, citing concerns for their upbringing, cultural identity, and future relationship with their British heritage. Meghan, upon discovering this, was devastated, but also furious. To her, it wasn't just betrayal. It was war. What followed was weeks of veiled threats, emotional distancing, and strategic silence. Meghan began sleeping in a separate room, according to staff. Harry stopped attending joint meetings with her brand consultants. Their public appearances dropped off the radar. Then came the night everything shattered. Neighbors recalled hearing a scream around 7:45 p.m., not the startled cry of a startled person, but the gut-wrenching sound of emotional collapse. The argument had reached its peak. Witnesses say it began in the kitchen and moved into the hallway. Plates were broken, chairs overturned. A door was reportedly punched. At the center of it all, a single, explosive declaration from Harry. "I'm filing for full custody, Meg. You can't stop me. They deserve to know my family." According to unconfirmed reports, Meghan's reply was equally volatile. "Over my dead body." One object was thrown, no one's sure by whom. That's when Meghan fell against the stair rail and Harry stumbled trying to catch her, cutting his arm on a glass-framed picture of their wedding day. That was when the silence set in. No more yelling. No more threats. Just two people, physically hurt and emotionally ruined, surrounded by broken glass and shattered promises. When police arrived minutes later, they had no idea they were walking into a domestic battlefield starring two of the most recognizable people in the world. The officers acted by protocol: evaluate for violence, check for injuries, and separate the parties. Their decision to handcuff both Meghan and Harry wasn't about scandal. It was standard procedure. But it ignited a storm that no one could contain. Within hours, gossip forums exploded. A neighbor's Ring camera had allegedly caught the flashing lights and captured the couple being escorted to waiting patrol cars. Photos began circulating. Rumors of mugshots spread like wildfire, although no official booking records have been released. The palace refused to comment. The Sussex PR team went silent. But the world didn't. Theories poured in from every corner of the internet. Had Meghan snapped? Had Harry planned this for months? Were the children present? Was this a mental health crisis, a custody grab, or the tragic climax of a marriage built on shaky ground? All we know for certain is this. That night, something inside the Sussex household broke in a way that can't be fixed with palace apologies, Netflix specials, or royal reconciliations. This wasn't just a fight. It was the manifestation of years of pressure, betrayal, identity conflict, and isolation. It was the moment the fairy tale crumbled, not in front of the cameras, but in the raw, private space of a home once meant to be their sanctuary. In the chapters that follow, we'll dig deeper into every layer of this unraveling. We'll explore Harry's growing desire to return to the UK, Meghan's fear of abandonment, the legal maze of international custody, the palace's silent fury, and, perhaps most chillingly, the leaked audio of that night. The recording that reportedly captured not just words, but the sound of a family falling apart. But before we go further, pause for a moment. What does it take for two people who once stood united against an empire to now be staring at each other across a broken room, wounded, defeated, and cuffed? What happens when royalty becomes reality? And most importantly, what happens next? It didn't happen all at once. Like most implosions of power couples, the slow unraveling began quietly, with glances that no longer lingered, words left unspoken at the dinner table, doors that closed just a little harder than necessary. The pressure inside the Sussex household had been building for months, if not years, but something about the early months leading up to the explosive fight had changed the dynamic in a way that even close friends couldn't ignore. From the outside, the Sussexes still lived the dream. Their $14 million Montecito mansion was the envy of many. Tucked into California's Golden Hills, surrounded by manicured gardens, far from the damp grays of London and the cold stares of Buckingham Palace. But as the press began to sour and media deals fell through, the royal escape that once symbolized freedom started to feel more like a well-decorated cage. Harry, who had once grinned through interviews about his second chance at life, had grown visibly restless. During a charity Zoom call in early spring, eagle-eyed viewers noted his uncharacteristically curt tone and wandering gaze. "He doesn't look well," one fan commented. "Like something's eating at him." It was more than just a bad day. According to several insiders, including a former security staff member who asked to remain anonymous, Harry had been increasingly withdrawn. He spent hours walking the property alone. He took long, aimless drives. At night, he could be heard in the backyard, sitting under the pergola where he used to read bedtime stories to Archie. Only this time, he was on the phone with someone. The voices were hushed, urgent. Some believe he was speaking to former military colleagues. Others think he was calling his brother William behind Meghan's back. Whatever the case, it was clear something was stirring inside him, and that Meghan didn't know the full extent of it. Meghan, for her part, was trying to reclaim the narrative. After the intense media spotlight of their Oprah interview and the fallout from Harry's explosive memoir, she had been advised to lie low. But Meghan was never one to sit idle while her reputation burned. She began arranging discreet meetings with media strategists in LA, reportedly seeking to reposition herself as a solo brand, one that didn't rely entirely on the Sussex identity. In quiet corners of Hollywood, whispers began to circulate. Meghan was shopping her own content ideas, a wellness series, a return to scripted drama, even a fashion line. And while none of this was officially confirmed, what rattled those closest to the couple was how little of this included Harry. One source close to Meghan's inner circle claimed she had grown tired of waiting for Harry to adapt. She wanted him to step up, to become a figure of power and influence in America, not just Britain's wounded prince, the source shared. But Harry still seemed emotionally tethered to the UK, to his past, and Meghan was moving forward, with or without him. The tension was subtle at first. Meghan began arriving late to joint Zooms. Harry skipped an important conference call with Netflix executives. Staff began noticing fewer shared meals, more solo outings. Even their parenting schedule reportedly became more divided, with Meghan spending mornings with the children while Harry took over in the evenings. But by the time summer arrived, the rift was no longer hidden. It had become a living, breathing presence inside the house. One that neither of them could escape, no matter how large their mansion was. And it wasn't just personal. Professionally, the cracks were visible. Spotify had quietly pulled out of their deal, ending what had once been heralded as a groundbreaking content partnership. Harry and Meghan's Archwell Audio had produced only one podcast series, and while it drew initial buzz, critics slammed it as unfocused and lacking soul. The cancellation was a blow, not just financially, but emotionally. Insiders say Harry took the news particularly hard. He had believed the deal was proof that they were thriving outside the royal system. When it collapsed, it reaffirmed what his doubters had been saying for years, that he was only marketable as long as he was connected to the drama of the royal family. Meghan, however, had a different reaction. She reportedly told a colleague, "It's just business. One door closes, another opens. We move on." That cold pragmatism, which had once impressed Harry, now left him feeling isolated. Where he sought purpose, she sought momentum, and their visions were no longer aligned. In the months leading up to the police incident, Meghan had begun spending more time in Los Angeles, sometimes overnight. Officially, she was attending meetings. Unofficially, she was seen with a new circle: influencers, producers, fashion editors. People who, according to one Hollywood columnist, saw her as a brand, not a duchess. Meanwhile, Harry was retreating further into himself. He'd stopped reading British news entirely, not because he didn't care, but because every headline seemed to jab at his heart. Reports of Kate's new public engagements, Charles's steady reign, William's growing popularity, all reminded him of the life he'd left behind, and the family he could no longer touch. In a rare moment of honesty during a private dinner with a friend, Harry reportedly said, "Sometimes I feel like I ran away from a burning building and ended up in a freezing desert. At least in the palace, I knew where I stood." That sentiment was not just poetic, it was prophetic. Because Harry hadn't just left a system, he had left an identity. And now, years later, the weight of that decision was bearing down on him with full force. His relationship with his father, King Charles, had thawed only slightly since Queen Elizabeth's passing. There were brief phone calls, mostly about logistics. An invitation here, a polite decline there. But emotionally, the divide remained. Harry missed his father. He missed his brother. He missed the invisible network of royal duty that, for all its flaws, had once given his life meaning. And then came the children. According to legal documents now under seal, Harry had begun exploring what would happen if he moved back to the UK and sought shared or even sole custody of Archie and Lilibet. It was a long shot, complicated, potentially scandalous, but in Harry's eyes, necessary. He worried about their future, about their cultural disconnect from Britain, about their exposure to a world he was still unsure of. He reportedly feared they were being raised as celebrities, not citizens. "I want them to know who they are," he told a confidant. not who the tabloids say they are. This fear became obsession. Meghan, upon discovering his private legal inquiries, felt betrayed. "You went behind my back," she allegedly said during a confrontation in their home. "You talked to lawyers, about taking my children away?" To Harry, they were their children. To Meghan, it felt like treason. And thus, the walls of Montecito began to close in. Staff noticed more tension. Dinners were quieter. Arguments louder. Meghan's mother, Doria, began visiting more frequently. Some say to support Meghan, others believe she was there to mediate. Either way, the message was clear: something was dangerously off. Then came a missed appearance at a major charity gala, the couple's first high-profile cancellation since stepping down as royals. No reason was given. No explanation offered. Meghan's team said it was a private matter. Harry's team said nothing at all. That week, Harry was spotted at a local cafe, alone, unshaven, with headphones in and a distant look in his eyes. One fan who approached him was met with a polite but icy smile. It wasn't just the public watching anymore. It was friends, family, advisors. Even the media had begun to shift tone. Where once the Sussexes had been portrayed as brave truth-tellers, now they were being framed as erratic, isolated, and unsure. One royal biographer put it plainly: they've lost control of the narrative. And when that happens in this business, the collapse is swift. Inside the Montecito compound, the pressure cooker was reaching its limit. And on one fateful evening, the steam would explode, leaving behind shards of glass, police reports, and 2 royals in handcuffs. When Prince Harry delivered his ultimatum, it was not during some dramatic showdown or public spat. It came in the still, heavy air of their private sitting room, a room once filled with warmth, laughter, and hope for a brighter future far removed from the confines of Buckingham Palace. That space, filled with children's toys, family portraits, and soft rugs imported from Morocco, had now become the setting of what some insiders say may have been the point of no return in Harry and Meghan's unraveling marriage. "I'm taking the kids, Meghan," he reportedly said, his voice low but charged. "I've already started speaking to someone in London. I'm going home, with them." The silence that followed was deafening. Meghan froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the teacup she was holding. At first, she didn't speak. She simply stared at him, as though trying to process whether this was a cruel joke or a moment of emotional insanity. But as Harry maintained his stance, his face drained of warmth, Meghan realized he meant it. This was not a threat. It was a declaration. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must first consider what their children symbolized, not only to them, but to the world. Archie Harrison and Lilibet Diana were not just royal offspring. They were the physical embodiment of the couple's defiance against the institution they fled, the hope of building a bridge between 2 cultures, 2 histories, 2 worlds. For Meghan, especially, the idea of losing control over their future felt like betrayal on a foundational level. "You wouldn't dare," she allegedly said, her voice cracking. "You don't get to destroy this family and then walk away with them like it was all your idea." Harry's response, while calm, only deepened the wound. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm trying to save what's left of it. They deserve roots. They deserve to know who they are. And right now, they don't." In the weeks leading up to this confrontation, Harry had become obsessed with the notion of heritage. According to a former staff member, he would often retreat to his study with dusty old albums of the royal family, photos of his mother Diana holding him at Balmoral, newspaper clippings of Queen Elizabeth during her coronation, images of royal pageantry, ceremonies, traditions. These weren't acts of nostalgia. These were searches for identity. It was as if he was trying to anchor himself, the staffer said, like he felt adrift and needed to remind himself that he came from somewhere real, somewhere structured. He missed the spine of royalty, even if he hated the cage that came with it. Meanwhile, Meghan had grown increasingly focused on their present and future in the United States. She had recently been in discussions to expand her brand, exploring everything from skincare to children's books to a new podcast series that didn't involve Harry at all. These were not mere vanity projects. They were attempts at building financial independence, media dominance, and personal legacy. But in Harry's eyes, these pursuits came at a cost: cultural detachment. Archie asks why he doesn't have a British accent. Harry reportedly told a confidant, "And I don't know what to say." He doesn't even know what Buckingham Palace is." The statement struck a chord with those close to him. It wasn't just about accents or castles. It was about belonging. Harry feared his children were growing up without any meaningful connection to the land, history, and family he had left behind. And the more they integrated into the glitzy, transitory world of American celebrity culture, the more he felt they were losing the very essence of who they were supposed to be. What made matters worse was the fact that Harry had kept his legal inquiries hidden. According to court insiders, Harry had reached out to 2 separate UK law firms to explore custody scenarios in the event of a transnational separation. His inquiries included detailed questions about residency requirements, jurisdictional authority, and the possibility of filing for emergency orders in a family court in England. Though no documents had been filed at that time, the legal community buzzed with quiet anticipation. "It's rare for someone of his stature to even consider a custody action like this," said a British family law attorney not affiliated with the case. "It would be politically and socially explosive." When Meghan discovered this clandestine research, her reaction was predictably volcanic. "You're going to sneak them out in the middle of the night?" she reportedly screamed during one argument. "What kind of father does that? What kind of man?" But Harry wasn't moved by the drama. He saw himself as acting in defense of his children's future. He believed that Meghan, for all her charisma and ambition, was driving the family into dangerous waters, exploiting the children's images for branding, cutting them off from their royal lineage, and molding them into American archetypes instead of allowing them to be a fusion of 2 legacies. According to palace insiders, King Charles had been made aware of Harry's turmoil weeks before the confrontation. The king reportedly instructed his legal advisors to stay on standby should Harry choose to return with the children. This preparation wasn't necessarily about reclaiming Archie and Lilibet for the crown. It was about preparing for the political, legal, and emotional storm that would follow such a move. The royal family, despite its public silence, understood the stakes. If Harry returned to the UK with the children, it would be seen not just as a personal decision, but a geopolitical event. The monarchy would be drawn into the most intimate crisis of the Sussex saga, a parental war that could reignite the transatlantic inferno they thought had long since died down. Meghan, meanwhile, wasn't without her own power plays. Upon learning of Harry's intentions, she immediately consulted her own team of attorneys, launching preemptive strategies to block any unilateral move. This included filings for sole residential custody under California law, which prioritizes the stability and routine of the child. Given that Archie and Lilibet had spent the majority of their lives in the U.S., legal experts agreed Meghan had a strong case. One source close to Meghan's legal circle claimed she said, "He can't just rip them away from me. I gave up everything for this family. I will not lose my children too." But for Harry, it wasn't about ownership. It was about reclamation. He saw his children slipping into a world of glitz and superficiality, surrounded by celebrity entourages, raised under the scrutiny of the media, and used, in his view, as extensions of a brand rather than protected from it. Meghan, he believed, couldn't see it. Or worse, she saw it and didn't care. The divide was no longer about country. It was about vision. And so the ultimatum stood. According to one source inside their household, the atmosphere in the home following the confrontation was one of unbearable tension. They began living in different wings of the mansion. Meals were eaten in silence. Nannies exchanged whispers, uncertain which parent to listen to. At one point, Meghan reportedly began recording conversations on her phone, fearing that Harry would twist her words in court. She was scared, the source said. Not physically, but emotionally. She felt like the rug had been pulled out from under her. And Harry? He wasn't triumphant. He was tired, exhausted, a man who had spent his entire life trying to outrun an institution, only to now realize that he had lost more than he gained. In quiet moments, he would sit with Archie and show him photos of Windsor Castle, of Princess Diana, of the Royal Guard. He would tell stories of his childhood, of horseback rides and polo matches, of Queen Elizabeth's corgis and summer holidays at Balmoral. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was indoctrination. But Meghan had her own methods. She would read Lilibet books about civil rights leaders and American trailblazers. She told the children about breaking barriers, about fighting for truth, about changing the story, even when it made people uncomfortable. 2 parents. two worldviews, two legacies, and two children caught in the middle. The custody bombshell was not just a legal conflict. It was a philosophical one. It was the manifestation of everything that had gone wrong between them. Competing identities, broken communication, diverging ambitions. And no matter how much they both loved their children, the path forward was becoming increasingly narrow. Eventually, this tension would ignite the night of the infamous fight, the night that would lead to 911 calls, police handcuffs, and a shattered image. But that night wasn't an isolated incident. It was the natural consequence of a long-brewing storm. A storm that began with love, bloomed with rebellion, and now threatened to tear apart not just a family, but a narrative that millions had believed in. The day had started like any other in Montecito. The air was thick with the scent of lemon trees and ocean breeze. The sun shone overhead, casting long golden streaks across the cobblestone driveway of the Sussex estate. But behind the tall hedges and closed gates of the mansion, the silence had been growing more ominous by the hour. Neighbors later recalled that there was an eerie stillness that day. No gardeners coming and going. No black SUVs pulling up with staff or consultants. No children's laughter echoing across the courtyard. For hours, it was as though the house itself was holding its breath. What nobody on the outside could have known was that tensions had been simmering behind the luxury walls since dawn. Harry and Meghan had barely spoken since the previous night's confrontation. The ultimatum hung between them like fog. Every movement in the house was cautious, calculated. They didn't so much speak as they did glance and avoid. The children, mercifully, were kept in the care of a nanny on the other side of the property, unaware of the emotional landmine their parents were dancing across. According to a close household source who later leaked details under strict anonymity, things began to unravel mid-afternoon. Harry, after locking himself in his private office for hours, emerged with a backpack and a determined expression. He walked into the kitchen where Meghan was seated at the table, reviewing notes for an upcoming meeting. He placed his phone down in front of her. "I booked my flight," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I leave on Sunday." Meghan didn't look up. "With the kids?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Harry didn't answer, but the silence was answer enough. Something snapped. It was as if all the restraint Meghan had been holding onto for days suddenly gave way. She rose from her chair, knocking it backwards. "You don't get to do this, Harry. You don't get to make decisions like this on your own." Harry, refusing to escalate, simply stood his ground. "I'm not stealing them. I'm taking them home." "That's not home," she shouted. "That's the prison you begged me to help you escape from." Their voices rose. The walls seemed to absorb the growing fury. Staff members reportedly began retreating from the main floor. One source said the head of housekeeping locked herself in the pantry. Another claimed a driver left the property altogether after hearing something crash in the dining room. The argument moved quickly from verbal to physical, not in the way tabloids salivate over, but in the real, tragic sense of people completely losing control. A vase was thrown, not directly at anyone, but in blind anger. It shattered against the floor near the kitchen island. Glass flew in every direction. Meghan stumbled backward. Harry stepped toward her instinctively, but in his rush, tripped on the edge of a rug and slammed into a corner table, splitting the skin on his forearm open. The sudden presence of blood changed everything. Meghan let out a panicked cry, rushing to him as he cursed under his breath. But instead of allowing her to help, Harry shoved her hand away. "Don't," he said. "Just don't." What happened next remains the subject of conflicting accounts. Some claim Meghan tried to take his phone, demanding to see who he had been texting. Others say Harry accused her of manipulating the kids against him. One version claims a framed photograph of their wedding day was knocked off the wall during the scuffle, ironic, tragic, poetic in its symbolism. But what is universally agreed upon is that a neighbor heard something so loud, so violent, that they were convinced someone's life was in danger. At 7:57 p.m., the Montecito Sheriff's Office received a 911 call. The dispatcher's notes, leaked weeks later to the press, read, "Caller reports screams, possible domestic dispute. Glass breaking. Sounded like someone fell. Multiple voices. Possible injury. Request immediate dispatch. Address verified." Within minutes, 2 patrol cars and an ambulance were on the scene. The security gate was open, a detail that puzzled authorities. Some speculated Harry had disabled it himself to allow the emergency services access more quickly. Others believed a staff member had taken initiative. Either way, the front entrance offered no resistance. The officers entered cautiously, one hand on his sidearm, the other radioing status updates to dispatch. Inside, the scene was chaotic. The living room looked like a storm had passed through. A lamp was overturned. Couch cushions had been flung to the floor. A rug was bunched up as if someone had tripped over it. In the hallway, shards of broken ceramic lay scattered near a bookshelf. Harry was standing near the center of the room, shirt stained with blood from his arm. Meghan was sitting at the bottom of the staircase, her knees pulled up to her chest, eyes swollen and red from crying. Her hand was wrapped in a dish towel. She had apparently cut it while picking up a piece of broken glass. Neither of them resisted as officers separated them. "We're not criminals," Harry reportedly said, more to himself than anyone else. "We have to follow protocol," one deputy replied. "You're both injured. This is a domestic incident. We need to get statements separately." As they were escorted outside, the flashing lights began to draw attention. A paparazzo parked 2 streets over had been tracking their address for weeks in hopes of catching a candid shot. Seeing the police presence, he grabbed his camera and began filming. Though no photos of the actual handcuffing have been officially released, sources close to the press circuit claim that stills from a body cam may have been offered to tabloids for 6 figures. Whether true or not, by the next morning, social media was flooded with rumors, partial images, and doctored clips showing what appeared to be Harry being led to a cruiser with his hands behind his back. The official report listed domestic disturbance with physical harm as the reason for detainment. Neither party was charged, but both were taken for separate questioning. Medical staff treated their injuries. Harry's arm was stitched on site, while Meghan's hand was bandaged and disinfected. The children, thankfully, had not been in the immediate area during the incident. They were reportedly in the care of a nanny in the guest house at the back of the property. The officers ensured their safety before leaving the residence. But the damage had already been done once the couple returned home. Hours later, in separate cars, the weight of what had occurred began to sink in. The silence between them was no longer strained. It was absolute, not the kind that begged resolution, but the kind that warned of impending collapse. Inside sources said Meghan cried for hours. Harry, meanwhile, took a long shower, emerged in fresh clothes, and sat outside by the fire pit alone until dawn. No words were exchanged that night, only distance. In the days that followed, the fallout extended far beyond their property. The media had caught wind of the incident, though no official statement was released. Tabloids speculated wildly. Some blamed Meghan. Others blamed Harry. Still others speculated the entire scene was fabricated for attention, though police records confirmed otherwise. The couple's PR team, usually quick to spin or deflect, remained ominously quiet. No denials, no clarifications, no social media posts to reset the narrative. The royal family declined comment when approached by British press, but insiders claimed that King Charles was briefed within hours. William, reportedly furious, told an aide, "He's spiraling, and she's dragging him down." Behind palace walls, contingency plans were quietly drafted. What if Harry did return to the UK? What if custody battles went public? What if the monarchy became legally entangled in a domestic dispute thousands of miles away? Meanwhile, in Montecito, Harry and Meghan were left to confront the wreckage. The trust between them had been ruptured, not simply by the fight, but by everything leading up to it: secrets, withheld plans, diverging priorities. The house that had once been a symbol of freedom and independence now felt like a prison of unresolved hurt. They began sleeping in separate wings permanently. Staff were given strict orders not to comment on the incident. Security was tightened. A new crisis management firm was hired. But none of it could undo the night the world found out that even princes and duchesses bleed. The image of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle being led out of their Montecito estate in handcuffs would have once been unthinkable. For a couple who had spent years crafting a narrative of freedom, healing, and humanitarian work, this moment represented the collapse of the very identity they had tried to forge since their departure from royal life. But when the police responded to that 911 call, protocol took precedence over pedigree. In California, the law is clear. In incidents involving suspected domestic disturbances where there are visible injuries to either or both parties, officers are mandated to detain those involved, even if the situation seems to have de-escalated by the time they arrive. The law isn't designed to punish, it's meant to protect. When two people are injured, and there's evidence of property damage and potential violence, both are detained until a full investigation can be conducted. That night, Meghan had a minor laceration on her palm. Harry had a bleeding gash on his forearm and bruises along the side of his ribs, likely from hitting the table during their earlier scuffle. The broken glass, overturned furniture, and disrupted household environment pointed toward physical conflict. The law didn't care that they were world-famous royals. The law responded to what it saw: two injured individuals in a volatile domestic situation. According to the responding officer's preliminary report, which was quietly leaked to the press weeks later, both Harry and Meghan complied without resistance. But their emotional states told very different stories. Harry was quiet, sullen, speaking in short, clipped sentences. He appeared more disappointed than angry, less reactive, and more like a man who had already come to terms with the weight of what had just happened. He offered his arm without argument as an officer cuffed him, grimacing only when the metal bit into the area around his wound. Meghan, by contrast, was visibly shaken. Her eyes darted between the officers, her breathing shallow. She kept repeating, "This is a misunderstanding. We're fine. We don't need this." She attempted to explain what had happened, that it had been an emotional disagreement that got out of hand, that no one had meant for anything to escalate. But explanations aren't enough once the report is filed. The officers weren't there to arbitrate emotions. They were there to ensure safety and begin a standard process. The moment she was asked to stand and place her hands behind her back, Meghan hesitated. But after a quiet exchange with one of the officers, a female deputy, she complied. Outside, two patrol vehicles were parked discreetly along the tree-lined driveway. No sirens, no shouting, just the click of doors opening and the shuffle of footsteps across the pavement. Meghan was placed in the back seat of one cruiser, Harry in the other. They were not told where they were going at first, only that they would be separated for questioning and assessment per standard operating procedures. What made this moment so shocking wasn't just the detainment itself, it was the context. The world had grown accustomed to headlines featuring Harry and Meghan, but never anything like this. Court disputes, family drama, even public criticism of the royal institution. These were now familiar chapters in their post-royal saga. But the visual of them being restrained, questioned, and driven off in separate cars in the night was a rupture in the public narrative that couldn't be easily repaired. Within hours, murmurs began circulating on online forums. A police scanner report mentioned high-profile residents in a domestic incident. A neighbor posted vague comments about sirens and unmarked vehicles. Someone else claimed to have footage from a Ring camera showing flashing lights and silhouettes. And then came the speculation. TMZ received a tip from an anonymous source describing the scene in graphic detail. Harry bleeding, Meghan crying, officers walking up the front steps. While they initially declined to publish anything without visual confirmation, screenshots began to flood social media, some real, many doctored. The most circulated image, a blurry photo of someone who resembled Harry being helped into a squad car, was later confirmed to be from a completely different incident in 2022. But by then, the fire had already spread. Royal correspondents across the UK woke up to inboxes flooded with the same question. Is it true? The palace refused to comment. So did the Sussex's spokesperson. But the silence was deafening. By morning, hashtags were trending worldwide. Hashtag Sussex scandal. Hashtag royal rupture. Hashtag handcuffed Harry. Some posts were mocking. Others were sympathetic. But the tone had shifted permanently. The mystique of invincibility that once surrounded the couple had fractured. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the legal process moved swiftly but delicately. Neither Harry nor Meghan were booked in the traditional sense. Because both parties were injured and no immediate charges were filed, they were held only for the duration of questioning and medical examination. They were given separate interview rooms, assigned 2 different deputies, and asked to recount what had happened. According to a deputy who later spoke off the record, Harry's account was consistent and calm. He admitted there had been a verbal fight, that emotions had escalated, and that the physical injuries were mostly outside. He said he didn't fear for his safety, nor did he believe Meghan intended harm. His only request was that the situation be resolved quickly and that his children not be involved in any way. Meghan, in her own interview, echoed many of the same sentiments, though her tone was reportedly more emotional. She described the incident as the result of accumulated stress, legal fears, and emotional exhaustion. She emphasized that Harry had never hurt her intentionally and that she hadn't meant to injure herself either. When asked if this kind of escalation had occurred before, she was silent for several moments before saying, "Not like this. Never like this." By dawn, both were released from custody and driven separately back to the estate. The staff had been instructed to remain off duty for the next 48 hours, except for the nanny and head of security. No one was to speak to press. No one was to post anything. A total blackout. Inside the house, the air was still. Meghan retreated to her suite without a word. Harry stayed downstairs, pacing the living room where just hours earlier their world had detonated. Neither slept. Neither ate. Both were consumed by the realization that something irrevocable had happened. In the days that followed, Meghan's legal team began drafting statements and contingency plans. They consulted crisis PR firms. Strategists debated whether to address the incident head-on or bury it beneath a series of controlled narratives. Ultimately, silence was chosen, at least for now. The logic was that any acknowledgement would legitimize the rumors and create a narrative that couldn't be managed. But Harry had other thoughts. He reportedly spoke to a former palace aide to inquire about what steps would need to be taken if he were to return to the UK with the children in the event of separation. It was a quiet, calculated inquiry, but one that made it clear he wasn't backing down. Meanwhile, in Britain, members of the royal family were watching closely. According to a senior royal insider, King Charles called an emergency meeting with advisors to assess the risk. "This isn't just a family matter anymore," the insider said. "It's a constitutional concern." Though the palace remained tight-lipped, internal memos were circulated regarding potential media statements and legal boundaries in the event the Sussexes' private custody dispute became a public scandal. William, for his part, remained silent publicly but was said to be deeply worried about Harry's mental state and the impact of the environment on his niece and nephew. There were even whispers, though unconfirmed, that members of Parliament had begun quietly discussing whether children in the royal line of succession who live abroad should have additional legal protections under UK law. The implications of Harry's arrest, even temporary, were being felt at the highest levels of British society. Back in California, the couple was spiraling in silence. Though physically under the same roof, Meghan and Harry were now operating in completely separate orbits. Their communications were limited to legal issues, child-rearing logistics, and staff coordination. They no longer slept in the same room. Shared meals became a thing of the past. Trust, once the fragile glue holding their world together, had fully disintegrated. And still, the public knew only fragments of the truth. Because what had occurred wasn't just a breakdown between two people, it was the rupture of a myth. The myth of the independent royal couple, stronger outside the institution, freer beyond the palace gates. That illusion had now been replaced by cold reality. Fame offers no shelter from pain. Royalty offers no immunity from collapse. In the coming weeks, more would be revealed. Legal documents, leaked audio, insider testimonies. But for many, it was this night, the night of the handcuffs, that marked the beginning of the end. The story that had once captivated the world with its promise of love, rebellion, and reinvention now stood on the edge of tragedy. And no one, not the crown, not the courts, not even the public, could look away. In the public eye, the love story between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle began like a modern fairy tale. A young prince disillusioned with royal life falls for a beautiful, independent American actress with a global mindset. Their courtship was brief, their engagement swift, and their wedding, broadcast to millions, symbolized a fresh start not only for the monarchy, but for a new kind of global love story. They spoke of change, compassion, unity, and purpose. Yet, what was so carefully curated for cameras and speeches was also laced with the beginnings of conflict. Conflict that would eventually curdle into what insiders now describe as a chronically strained and increasingly unmanageable relationship. What made Harry and Meghan's union so magnetic at first was also what eventually began tearing it apart. Two strong individuals shaped by very different worlds, both bearing emotional scars and determined to rewrite their own narratives. In the early days, this shared passion bonded them. But as pressures mounted, it also drove a wedge between them. According to friends who knew them before their royal engagement, the intensity of their connection was undeniable, but so was the pace. From their first meeting to moving in together, everything happened quickly. It was like watching a fire ignite in real time, said one close associate. They didn't want to wait. They didn't want to slow down. They were determined to make the world bend to them. In hindsight, some now suggest that this whirlwind intensity was also a warning sign. Meghan had spent her adult life building a career in Hollywood, navigating auditions, roles, scripts, and social activism. She was used to being the author of her own story, the controller of her image. Harry, on the other hand, was born into a world where image was crafted by teams of advisors, where spontaneity was discouraged, and where silence was often equated with dignity. When Meghan entered the royal family, the adjustment was jarring. The media frenzy, the outdated protocols, the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racism she faced in both tabloid columns and palace hallways. It was more than any woman should endure. Harry, ever the protector, reacted with fierce loyalty. He saw in Meghan a mirror of his mother Diana, misunderstood, cornered, hunted by the press. But this protector dynamic began to evolve in dangerous ways. Sources close to the couple said that Meghan often felt smothered by Harry's hypervigilance. While she appreciated his support, there were times she reportedly pushed back. "I'm not your mother," she was overheard telling him during a tense conversation on the set of a charity event in early 2019. "I know how to take care of myself." That statement would become emblematic of a deeper issue. Harry was haunted by the past, by Diana's death, by the media, by the suffocating royal protocols that he believed killed her. He projected that fear onto his marriage. Meghan, for her part, was haunted by her own past, by a fractured relationship with her father, by the constant struggle to prove herself in elite circles, by a career in which every ounce of attention had to be earned. She projected that ambition onto her marriage. Both were looking for healing, but they were using different tools. During their brief royal tenure, cracks in the foundation began to show. Staff turnover was unusually high at Kensington Palace. Several aides quit within months of being hired. The media spun stories about Meghan being difficult or demanding, while others described her as decisive and ambitious. But behind the headlines, the truth was more nuanced. Meghan, insiders said, often clashed with royal aides because she expected Hollywood efficiency in an institution that thrived on tradition and patience. Harry, torn between defending her and upholding royal decorum, found himself increasingly isolated. Their move to North America, the so-called Megxit, was framed as a bold declaration of independence. But privately, the decision wasn't unanimous. While both had grown tired of royal scrutiny, Harry reportedly had second thoughts about leaving entirely. According to a former palace staffer, Harry had floated the idea of keeping one foot in the door, offering to remain part-time and continue representing the Queen abroad. But the palace rejected the idea, and Meghan, determined to move forward, reportedly told Harry, "We're either in or we're out. You decide." He chose out. In the months that followed, their public image was carefully crafted. The Oprah interview, Netflix deals, podcast launches, these were all steps in their carefully laid out vision of post-royal relevance. But behind the scenes, tensions were brewing. One former staffer who briefly worked with them during the early Archewell days described the atmosphere as chaotic. Meetings were frequently rescheduled. Harry and Meghan were rarely in the same room at the same time. When they did appear together, Meghan often led the discussion while Harry seemed distracted or irritable. It felt like they were trying to run a business while in the middle of a marital Cold War, the staffer said. Financial stress also contributed. Despite lucrative deals, the pressure to maintain their new lifestyle, complete with a Montecito mansion, private security, and PR teams, was immense. Meghan's drive to constantly expand their brand created friction. Harry, more introverted and purpose-driven, reportedly became frustrated with what he saw as an overemphasis on image and influence rather than substance. He wanted to focus on mental health. She wanted to build an empire, said one former associate. They weren't always on the same page. As time passed, the emotional disconnect deepened. Friends of Meghan began visiting more frequently, while Harry took to long solo walks, often disappearing for hours. Meghan reportedly began keeping a private schedule, coordinating her own engagements without consulting Harry. Their communication became transactional, centered around their children, their image, their staff, not their bond. They smiled in public, but rarely laughed in private. One of the most telling signs of the strain came during an event in New York City, where the couple was photographed leaving a hotel hand in hand, but according to a crew member working backstage, had just finished arguing. They went from yelling in the green room to holding hands in front of the cameras. It was like flipping a switch. The pressure to perform, to live up to the global narrative of a perfect couple who defied monarchy to find love and freedom, became unbearable. Even their shared mission began to diverge. Harry's projects with military veterans, environmental campaigns, and mental health initiatives were deeply personal. Meghan, while supportive, often appeared more focused on media-driven initiatives, documentaries, lifestyle ventures, influencer collaborations. These differences, while not inherently divisive, began to expose fault lines in how they viewed their legacy. Harry wanted redemption. Meghan wanted reinvention. And they were no longer walking side by side. Insiders claim the couple briefly tried marriage counseling in early 2023. A therapist reportedly visited their home twice a week for nearly 2 months. While initial sessions were productive, progress stalled as deeper issues came to the surface: trust, resentment, control. Meghan allegedly felt Harry had emotionally abandoned her. Harry, in turn, felt manipulated and unheard. One quote from a session, leaked to a tabloid months later, reportedly had Meghan saying, "You say you're escaping the crown, but you act like you still wear it." To which Harry allegedly replied, "And you act like you're building a kingdom without me." These weren't just clever retorts, they were truth bombs. By the time summer rolled around, their physical intimacy had all but vanished. They slept in different rooms. Staff were instructed to refer to them separately in scheduling meetings. Family photos were quietly removed from shared spaces. Meghan focused on her next venture, believed to be a solo media project. Harry reached out to his UK contacts, re-establishing ties that had long gone quiet. Each step was a retreat. Not just from each other, but from the partnership they once built on shared rebellion. What's most tragic about their history of conflict is not that they fell out of love, but that they stopped fighting for the same future. In the beginning, they stood together against the world. But over time, they began standing on opposite ends of the same battlefield. They didn't just stop being allies, they became each other's obstacles. And so, when the explosive fight happened, the 911 call, the blood, the police response, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was the logical crescendo of months, if not years, of emotional erosion. The handcuffs weren't the start of their crisis. They were merely the exclamation point at the end of a sentence neither of them wanted to write. While the events unfolding in Montecito shocked much of the public, they were not met with surprise behind palace walls. Inside Buckingham Palace, a series of private meetings and classified memos had been quietly circulating for months. The royal household, though frequently portrayed as reactive, had long prepared for some kind of implosion in Harry and Meghan's post-royal life. But what they had not anticipated, or at least not publicly acknowledged, was that the consequences of that implosion could circle back and damage the crown in real time. On the morning following the incident, as reports began trickling through the press, King Charles III was briefed at Windsor Castle during his regular morning intelligence meeting. According to a source within the royal communications team, the early brief contained very little detail. Unconfirmed reports of police responding to a domestic incident involving the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. No arrests confirmed. Children reportedly unharmed. But by midday, the briefing was significantly updated. By then, royal advisors had received partial verification through diplomatic channels in California. The confirmation of police involvement, injuries, and temporary detainment triggered what insiders now describe as a containment protocol. The crown was officially facing a scandal involving a senior royal figure in a foreign land, a potential legal case involving child custody, and a wave of negative press powerful enough to destabilize the monarchy's public narrative. A senior courtier described the mood in the palace as white-hot with controlled panic. While no one was shedding tears for Harry and Meghan's media troubles, especially after years of perceived betrayal, the threat this posed to the monarchy's long-term image was real and immediate. The royal family has always known how to survive scandal. From King Edward VIII's abdication to Princess Margaret's controversial love life, and from Prince Andrew's catastrophic associations to Charles and Diana's televised divorce, they've navigated the worst of public opinion. But Harry was different. He was the spare, the son of Diana, a man whose pain and vulnerability had made him uniquely endearing to the public for decades. To now have him involved in an alleged domestic incident, with children in the background, was not only tragic but dangerous. If the narrative turned toward Harry being a victim of palace neglect or emotional abandonment again, the institution could be blamed all over again. To prevent that, damage control was launched immediately. Lord Chamberlain's office coordinated with the palace press office to begin monitoring all public narratives. Key terms like handcuffed, custody, children, and emotional instability were placed on tracking lists across social media platforms. Simultaneously, attorneys from the Royal Legal Department were placed on standby for consultations related to privacy protections and succession implications. In a hastily convened private meeting between King Charles, Princess Anne, and Prince William, sources say voices were raised behind closed doors for the first time in many months. Princess Anne, ever the pragmatist, was said to have been blunt in her assessment. This is not just a domestic meltdown. It's a reputational bomb waiting to go off. William, whose relationship with Harry had already been reduced to rare formal contact, reportedly reacted with cold fury. He's dragged the institution into chaos from 6,000 miles away. Again, but Charles's reaction was more complex. Though he had often been portrayed as distant from his younger son in the press, insiders say he had attempted reconciliation behind the scenes more than once. When Harry released his memoir, Charles's initial reaction was reportedly one of sorrow, not anger. He's wounded, and he's looking for someone to blame, Charles said at the time, according to a longtime courtier. Now, with police reports, physical injuries, and headlines blaring phrases like royal handcuffs, Charles had little room left for sympathy. Still, the monarch made it clear that a full-scale royal denouncement of Harry was off the table. We cannot disown him, not when the public is watching. Instead, the royal strategy shifted to what one advisor called controlled dissociation. The idea was to quietly affirm the monarchy's distance from the Sussexes without publicly condemning or engaging with them. This tactic involved subtle but strategic moves, erasing Sussex mentions from upcoming event briefings, delaying the release of archival footage involving the couple, and emphasizing the public duties of other working royals. But that didn't mean the family was passive. Behind the scenes, Charles reportedly began consulting legal experts in international family law. The concern was not just about Harry's well-being or public perception. It was about Archie and Lilibet. If Harry did decide to return to the UK with his children, with or without Meghan, the palace wanted to understand the implications. Could a prince's children be brought back across borders in the midst of a private custody battle? Would the crown have any standing in court to intervene, especially if public outcry demanded stability? Meanwhile, lawyers quietly discussed a more controversial possibility, a formal request for Harry to relinquish his place in the line of succession. Though such a request would be politically volatile and constitutionally complex, advisors feared that continued scandals involving Harry, particularly those involving law enforcement or custody battles, could destabilize public confidence in the monarchy's moral authority. While Harry was currently sixth in line to the throne and unlikely to ever reign, the symbolic risk remained high. One advisor, speaking under the condition of anonymity, explained the reasoning. If he's seen as unstable or reckless, and yet still a heartbeat away from the throne, that sends a dangerous message. We have to protect the optics, if nothing else. Princess Anne reportedly supported the idea. A royal traditionalist, she had long believed that monarchy was a duty, not a stage. She allegedly told aides, he left. He should not keep the privileges of staying in line when he no longer carries the burden. But others advised caution. Removing Harry from the succession could trigger a backlash among younger generations who still view him as a reformer and an emotional beacon within a rigid institution. The risk of looking petty or punitive was not one the palace was eager to take. Instead, Charles authorized a more surgical approach. Begin working with royal legal partners in Parliament to assess precedent, but hold back from action until a formal custody filing is submitted by either party in the United States or the UK. If and when that happened, the palace would be ready. In the meantime, British embassies in Washington and Los Angeles were quietly instructed to provide updates on any developments related to the Sussex situation. Though royal family members are technically private citizens when abroad, their unique legal and diplomatic status often requires government coordination, especially when minors are involved. Back in the UK, the reaction among courtiers and long-serving palace staff was a mix of resignation and quiet anger. Many felt that the royal family had spent years trying to keep the door open for Harry, only to have it slammed in their faces with every new drama. "He doesn't want to be in the system," one senior aide said, "but he won't stop dragging it with him everywhere he goes." Public reaction was even more divided. Royal loyalists filled comment sections with anger. "This is what happens when you abandon tradition. He left a legacy of duty for Hollywood nonsense. Bring the children home to where they belong." But others expressed empathy. "Harry's broken, and no one helped him heal. He's trapped in a war between love and trauma. Both of them need help, not hatred." Amid this swirl of opinions, what became undeniably clear was this: the palace was bracing for a long, painful chapter. One that could involve courtrooms, press battles, leaked documents, and international custody negotiations. And they would have to navigate it all while maintaining the poise and distance demanded by centuries of royal tradition. In the coming weeks, as more details emerged about the fight, the injuries, and the possible custody filings, Buckingham Palace would remain publicly silent. But behind closed doors, preparations were being made. Because whether the crown liked it or not, one of its own had ignited a firestorm, and the winds were blowing straight toward the gates of the monarchy.